Bernie too radical to win the presidency? If you watch cable news at all, you're surely familiar with that line of questioning. Never mind that Bernie has built his candidacy on big-ticket policy issues that are, according to consistent polling, each hugely popular with American voters. Even after years of negative advertising, paid for by the insurance and pharmaceutical industries,
forced into a one-size-fits-all government insurance system.
87% of Democrats and 63% of all Americans support Medicare for all. Most Americans support canceling medical debt, which is interesting since only Bernie has a plan to do it. And 73% of Democrats and nearly half of Republicans support putting workers on corporate boards. Yet still, the fear-mongering that asks, will progressivism play in the Midwest, is all too common.
Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders says he's a Democratic socialist. What do voters think of that? That used to be a really scary word. Is it still?
I think that you can't win the White House without the Midwest, and I don't think that you can go too far to the left and still win the Midwest.
Bernie is supposedly too far left to appeal to moderates. He may own the so-called progressive lane of the Democratic Party, but how will he appeal to the general electorate come November? He may have the most committed base in the race, but is that enough to clinch the presidency? Turns out the concerned trolls can relax because Bernie is unique among the candidates in his tremendous crossover appeal. No one does better with independents than Bernie Sanders, including Joe Biden. And no one has raised more money in Obama to Trump districts than Bernie. Bernie does well with voters of color. He's #1 with Latino voters and has the least white, most working class supporters in the race. And perhaps most baffling to those afflicted with pundit brain, Bernie has received more donations from people serving in the US military than any other candidate. Just about every time I've attended a Bernie rally, I've run into veterans who see their experience serving our country as completely compatible with Bernie's agenda. It's not actually that confusing if you think about it. Independent streak? Check. Experience with excellent government-run healthcare? Check. Fondness for no-nonsense leaders who wear the same thing every day? Check and check. But all kidding aside, it's not difficult to see why Bernie is popular among vets. Bernie has been a leader on foreign policy, from his lonely vote against the Iraq War to his Yemen Powers Resolution, which passed both the House and a Republican Senate before being vetoed by Trump. Bernie has been a clarion voice against our endless wars. He's also been a staunch defender of veterans' rights, saying often that you can judge a country by how it treats those who have served. He became chairman of the Senate Veterans Committee in 2013 and notes that the first bill he ever introduced in Congress called for reimbursing members of the National Guard Reserve for income they lost while deployed. The Veterans Administration runs the largest healthcare system in the country with a $55 billion medical care budget and 288,000 employees. Bernie has worked to strengthen the VA internally, famously passing a veterans bill with John McCain that's so good, Trump won't stop trying to take credit for it.
We passed VA Choice so they can see their doctor.
And as it turns out, because of their direct experience with quote-unquote government healthcare, veterans are some of the most vocal advocates for Medicare for all. This week, I spoke with two vets about why they support progressive politics. First, I chatted with Kyle Bibby, a Marine veteran who is also an organizer with Common Defense, a grassroots organization founded by veterans who oppose Trump's corrupt agenda of hate. Next, I chatted with Hector Barajas, a Mexican-born US veteran who was deported after his service and who now runs an advocacy group called Banished Veterans for Deported Veterans. But before we get to it, I just want to remind you that if you haven't already, please download the Bern app, start organizing your friends, sign up to make calls or texts for Bernie, or travel to an early state and knock doors. During last week's debate, Bernie had the best fundraising hour of this entire race. We raised $1.7 million from more than 100,000 small dollar donors in one day alone. Thank you so much for supporting this movement. We are so close. We got this. I'm so glad to be joined today by Kyle Bibby, who is a veteran, co-founder of the Black Veterans Project, and an organizer with Common Defense. Thank you for joining us, Kyle.
Thank you for having me.
So can you tell me a little bit about these organizations, perhaps starting with the Black Veterans Project? Why did you feel a need to start a group particularly dealing with the issues that Black veterans face?
So a friend and I, we were both, graduates of Columbia Policy School. We started realizing during our journey through the VA, post-military, that there are a lot of discrepancies that Black veterans are facing out in the community. And we decided that, since nobody was really addressing this, and a lot of people don't understand how the military justice system works, or even how the VA works, that we should start making a bit of a fuss about it. And we sat down, started brainstorming, and determined that we wanted to tell the story of Black veterans and preserve their history, as well as build a grassroots Black veteran organization that can direct people power towards institutions and really press the case for a more equitable military.
So what are some of the particular needs that you feel like need to be addressed more with respect to Black veterans? What kind of disparities do you see there?
So the interesting thing is that pretty much everything that you see civilian side is mimicked in the military. So just as the civilian justice system is more likely to have harsher penalties, more likely to charge Black citizens more than not, the same thing's happening in the military, but people don't understand that the military justice system is its own system. So when you're talking about criminal justice reform, oftentimes, you're not necessarily talking about what's taking place on military bases or with military commanders when they're adjudicating cases within their units. So the outcomes are often the same as the civilian justice system. The same happens with the VA. Now, the Department of Veterans Affairs has a number of different social programs, home loans and educational programs. The access to that often is not as, it's not reaching Black veterans as much as it's reaching other communities. And part of that is, it's tied to a lot of the issues that you see around healthcare access for civilians as well. But, we're talking about a community where we're all in the military, right? And we're going to leave the military at some point. So you think that they can brief you on what your benefits are going to be. And that's something that the military deals with in general, just problems getting the information to all veterans, but particularly Black veterans when they go back to their communities.
That's so interesting because in the other interview that I've done for this episode, it's a veteran who was a non-citizen. He's a Mexican citizen. And he similarly said that a lot of veterans who aren't American also think that by serving that they were automatically going to get citizenship, and there's a lot of opacity around the process, and that people find themselves deported and find themselves in these bungles for exactly this reason. There just isn't a very good communication system set up for veterans. I want to ask you how you came to serve.
So my story is, I'm from New Jersey, and I lived in Franklin Township growing up just outside of New Brunswick, and we're a short distance from New York. And I remember 9/11 actually having a really big impact on me. I was 15 when it happened, and it was the first time that I was afraid of something that just seemed completely out of my control. So for me, I decided that I wanted to be a part of a solution in some way. And what I reasoned was that joining the military was the best way for me to do that. I bargained with my mother. She was like, "You're not going to enlist. I want you to be an officer and go to college first." And she actually, funny story, thought she was going to have me go to the Naval Academy, apply there, because she didn't think I'd get in. And then I ended up getting in. She told me this years later. She's like, "Oh, I'll have him apply to the Naval Academy. He won't get in. Then he'll go to normal college and he'll forget all about it." And then I got into the academy, which we were both very surprised. And then, 4 years later, I ended up a Marine officer. So
Okay, so where did you serve and for how long?
So I was active duty for about 5.5 years. I did 1.5 years roughly in the reserves. And I was with 1st Marine Regiment out in Southern California. I deployed with the 13th Marine Expeditionary Unit. So that's just essentially a bunch of Marines on a ship doing nothing unless something bad happens. It's kind of cool. It's not as nice as your typical cruise ship, but if you're a Marine, you don't have anything to do. You can work out, eat food, play video games. But then my subsequent deployment was to Afghanistan. So
And what was that experience like?
Really eye-opening. And honestly, for me, it's what changed my worldview a lot and actually made me significantly more progressive, and got me questioning a lot of the things that I had been told about why we were there, and just generally how, I guess, different communities exist around the world, how the U.S. military and our foreign policy affects all of that. Yeah, it all started there.
So tell me more about that, because I think for a lot of people, there are certain stereotypes in their minds about what the politics of people in the military are like, and they might be surprised by the idea that your experience in overseas, in particular, made you more progressive.
So there's a couple reasons why I think people assume that people in the military are almost all conservative. First, they're not. Most people in the military are actually more likely to be anti-establishment or anti-authority, which is a bit counterintuitive, right? Because they're in the military. But generally, their politics is such where they generally are more independent-minded. They don't like political parties. So they gravitate actually towards candidates like Bernie Sanders for that reason, right? So the reason I think, though, why particularly conservatives or Republicans are seen as, the winners of the military or like dominating the military, it's just history. It traces back to the 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was a massive cut in military funding that happened during a Democratic president. The culture of the military then was, oh, it's the Democrats' fault. They'll cut your pay, they'll cut your budget. And that just carried over. So a lot of the senior staff, NCOs, staff non-commissioned officers and senior officers now, they remember that, and they have kind of a, maybe a bitter feeling towards some Democrats. And in general, I think there is maybe a bit of a leaning towards folks who are, particularly during wartime, might be more interested in international endeavors to quote unquote spread democracy, right? Yeah. So, but ultimately, most of the people who are joining the military, they're apolitical, and it's their experiences in the military that are going to form a lot of their political opinions. And the people that are progressive in the military, the folks that are, and I mean, Bernie Sanders does really well among veteran donations and donors. I mean, those folks are, they're resonating with that worldview, that people deserve human rights and dignity. And some of the ways that you unfortunately learn it are when you're overseas and you see people who don't have it. So
you now organize with Common Defense. You organize, it's an organization that organizes progressive veterans, right? And I wonder if your experience being in the military and kind of being in close quarters with people with a really broadly diverse political and personal backgrounds, if that has taught you anything about how to reach out and communicate to people here now who are so ideologically diverse and are kind of increasingly balkanized, increasingly feeling like we're divided up into political buckets that are very difficult to cross.
Common Defense is a very interesting organization and fun, quite frankly. I'm really lucky to be one of their lead organizers. We always say that, well, not even say, there's evidence that when veterans are doing things like canvassing or trying to do a one-on-one or just talk with people, generally people are more receptive, and especially other veterans. I mean, and politics aside, it's oftentimes a bit of it bridges a gap that might otherwise be difficult to bridge. So we definitely use that to our advantage. And one of the biggest campaigns that we run is actually called the End the Forever War campaign, of which the first signer was Bernie Sanders. And that campaign is generally, for me, when I'm meeting new veterans and I want to see if they want to get involved, I start there because among veterans, it's almost 70% or higher, roughly, that believe that these wars have gone on too long, that they haven't really served to make the United States safer, and that oftentimes they ultimately make us less safe. So we can get folks from across the political spectrum with issues like that. And then from there, we talk, again, about a lot of the different issues that I think Bernie Sanders really talks a lot about. People feeling like wages are just squeezing them. Frustrations around healthcare access, particularly for veterans. Right. The suicides that veterans deal with. I mean, every single service member I know knows somebody, unfortunately, who's either attempted or completely went through with a suicide. For me personally, I know 5.
Wow.
So this is all about mental health access. And for folks who might not have close access to a local VA. Or just in general, not even just veterans who deserve good health care, right? I have health care for life, but, my friends and family don't, and making sure that that's something that a community can get, it's imperative. So, we really push a lot of those issues, and oftentimes that resonates with veterans across the board. So.
what do you think? I always want to ask people who are actually organizing, who are doing door knocking, to give us some insight into the kinds of conversations they're having, because so much of the political discourse, especially when you're talking about the mainstream news, is an abstraction. And so, I mean, what kinds of responses do you get when you're going door to door? Yes, being able to connect with people better because you're a veteran and there's an earned respect that is inherent to that relationship. But then you're talking about progressive issues that haven't always been as front of mind, that are kind of newer to the fore, and who there are, broad swaths of the country that, at least according to the mainstream media, find to be kind of radical and too far left. Is that something that you've encountered in your experience? And if so, how do you bridge that?
It's interesting when people talk about how radical or, impractical like some of these policies are, because that's not our experience at all. What we've seen is, like, when we talk to people about healthcare access or things like that, most people actually do think that everyone should have access to healthcare, and it shouldn't necessarily be about how much money you can put forth. The question becomes, well, how can we pay for it, this and that? And I mean, that's for the policy wonks to figure out. Like, organizers aren't going to sit there and break out the charts and the budget tables. But nonetheless, the values are there. That worldview, that respect for human rights and dignity is consistent. And when we have these conversations with folks, and same with ending the wars, like I said, we can bring in almost any veteran with that. And also acknowledging that maybe these wars were a mistake from the beginning, right? Yeah. So from what I've seen, the gap isn't as wide as I think people would have folks believe. And I also think that getting out to people, meeting them where they're at, and trying to have a conversation, oftentimes it's a lot better than being talked at, which is kind of what the media does a lot of times. Yeah. They want to tell you what people are thinking, but I'm skeptical, I think, sometimes at how divided we truly are.
Now, I know it hasn't all been a walk in the park now when you're having these conversations with people either you served with or you encounter in the course of your organizing. I mean, what do you think is the biggest obstacle to, connecting with someone from the other side of the aisle? And do you have any tips for listeners about how to get past it? I mean, do you have any truly knockdown, drag out? I mean, because I follow you on Facebook, and I've seen you have a Facebook argument or two.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, well, particularly among my Facebook friends, they all know where I stand. But I think in general, there's rarely been times where things have been really tough for us. And granted, I will certainly check my veteran privilege in the sense that when we go to meet with folks, veteran or not, oftentimes it's a shame that I think sometimes get all this, reverence, because I think everyone should have access to healthcare, right? Wouldn't it be nice if we all had the VA?
Right, right.
But, it's still something that I think we get when we do meet with people. People aren't going to sit there and necessarily call me a crazy libtard when, when I'm like, hey, by the way, I was a Marine infantry officer for several years. And they're like, oh, well, okay, we have agree to disagree. It's like, so, checking that. But I mean, most of the time, we don't really deal so much with folks who are tough on us for our worldview. But figuring out what issues I think that there's a lot of common ground, dwelling there, and then just kind of peeking out here and there is generally what we try to focus on when we're dealing with someone who might not be the same ideological spectrum.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because, I find a lot less resistance myself than you would guess based on how I think the media characterizes our campaign and characterizes rather any progressive movement in this country. And I think it is because it is so policy focused, and that the policies that have been chosen are precisely those that are popular. So when we talk about populism, I mean, oftentimes it's a conversation about what Trump is doing with this kind of faux populism and, injected with nativism and all of the xenophobia, et cetera. But I think there's a really strong argument that the best way to push back against that is by doing exactly what Bernie Sanders is doing, is by saying, look, there are all of these things like Medicare for all and a $15 or more minimum wage that are overwhelmingly popular, not just among Democrats, but even among conservatives, and that the reason that we haven't been able to have those things isn't because it's an electoral, bombshell. Or that it would, there's just not the votes for it, but because the people who represent us aren't actually representing us, and they have other interests that are dictating their policy goals. So it's who they're taking money from, and the issue of money in politics resonates really broadly. So it is strange. I asked you that question, but I think I would have had a similar answer. That it's not actually that tough a sell when you're talking about policies as opposed to personalities or some of the other factors that have sometimes driven politicians on both sides of the aisle that have been kind of front and center in terms of how they've identified and how their pitch has been, likability, things like that. Yeah. Not to say that I don't think Bernie Sanders is very likable.
Oh, sure. Yeah. No, I definitely agree. I think, and you got to be a little strategic in your conversations, so when we tell people we're vet organizers, we don't immediately start off with, we're progressive vet organizers and we're looking to totally lift up this
full socialism now.
Yeah, like we're not like going that route, but yeah, we have the conversation about values, about outcomes. Like imagine a country where people didn't have to struggle to make ends meet. Where people who worked full time were getting wages that they could live off of. Who wouldn't like that, right? Yeah. And then you start asking the questions about, okay, then what policies can we enact? Oh, by the way, there's a guy who's doing this. You kind of work your way there, and that's how I think you gain a lot with folks. But I mean, for us also, a lot of folks are just disengaged. Like I said, I mean, for veteran organizing, there's actually a good amount of veteran organizing that happens on the other side. So conservatives go to great lengths to organize veterans, and they're effective at it. And it's something that I think on the left that people have not necessarily invested in as much as they should. Now, Bernie Sanders has, I actually know his veteran campaign, advisor, right? Dennis White. He actually went to the Veterans Organizing Institute, which is a program with Common Defense. So I've done organizing work with him. Yeah. And a couple other campaigns, like Liz Warren has one, I think Pete Buttigieg. So it's happening slowly. But you lose every battle you don't show up to, and as long as the left isn't trying to have this conversation and also demonstrate that these policies help you, like ultimately when you ask a working class veteran, do you want for your wife to have a good living wage? Do you want your kids to have their education paid for? Or do you want maybe an upgrade to your M4? It's like, nah, my rifle's fine. It'll work, when I really need it. These are reliable. I don't need like billions and billions of dollars necessarily to keep going towards corporations and billionaires who, although might be making the next, advanced piece of equipment, whatever, what people still are concerned most about in the military as well, is what's directly in front of them. And that's their families, that's their wages, that's their health care, it's things like that. So
and this is such an interesting point, because for so many people, supporting the troops ends up boiling down to increasing a military budget. But a statistic that I recently realized and have been parroting 24/7, because I find it to be so visceral and compelling, is that it would cost $81 billion to cancel all medical debt, which is the same amount that many Democrats, including lots in the presidential field, voted to increase Trump's military budget by. Right? So it really does seem to be this priority issue. The folks who ask how you're going to pay for it don't ask that when we're talking about increasing the military budget of a person who everybody agrees is not well suited to have their finger on the button and to have the power that he does. At the same time, the questions emerge when we're talking about medical debt, where 500,000 people in the wealthiest country in the history of the world are going bankrupt every year from medical debt. Do you find that people are kind of stuck on that, on the kind of narrow definition of how to support the military? Is that something that you talk about as you're organizing people, how best to support the military?
Oh yeah, I mean, I regularly rant about this. I think I don't expect everyone to have a deep down understanding of where exactly every dollar is going for the military budget. But when you look at discretionary spending, and for those who don't know, discretionary spending is essentially the money that's allocated every single year. So when they say that they have a spending bill, most of that is what they're talking about. And it's, I want to say, about a third of the total spending that the federal government does every single year. Half of that is DOD. The other half of that is everything else. So Department of Justice, Housing, Health and Human Services, all those other departments that we talk about that are cabinet level agencies, they're being funded with roughly the same amount of money that just goes to the Pentagon, that just goes to DOD. And within that, people think that when you're cutting the military budget, we're talking about, or even holding it steady, right? You're talking about holding steady military pay. Military pay is about, I think it's roughly 150 or 60 billion. I mean, it's a lot, but I mean, it's not a lot compared to the whole number.
Budget, yeah.
And I think it was since 2016, we're talking over $100 billion worth of funding increases for the Pentagon in a war that's been going on for 19 years. And that money, most of it is not going to the lance corporals, the privates, the petty officers, and it's going towards big contracts. It's going towards Raytheon, it's going towards General Dynamics, all these companies that make billions and billions of dollars off of our capacity for committing war overseas. And ultimately, again, it goes back to what I said before. When I was in Afghanistan, I started questioning, how much is this really making my community safer? And how much is this actually positively impacting the United States? And I'm skeptical, and it's a very high price for us to be very skeptical of that.
Well, what kind of things did you see? What kind of things were you experiencing there that made you feel that way?
There's a broad, set of experiences that people have when they're deployed. There's people who are in combat every single day. There are folks who will spend their entire deployment and it'll be the most boring experience of their life. We had a little bit happen during my deployment. Mostly it was, we had an area that was completely saturated with IEDs. One of the most heavily IED'd, and that's improvised explosive devices, heavily IED'd areas in Helmand Province at the time in Garmshire District. So we spent all day with EOD teams just finding them, and I mean, it's a very stressful life. And what you realize is part of the reason why those bombs are there were to get at U.S. service members. And we were there to hopefully try and, take down the Taliban who were there. We were going after them because of their ties to Osama bin Laden, but Osama bin Laden wasn't even there. He was in Pakistan. And then I was actually in Afghanistan when Osama bin Laden's killed. And you see how this eventually becomes this okay, we started with Osama bin Laden in 9/11, and now we actually have a gripe with someone who's completely different to Taliban. And now we're in a district where our presence is causing the entire community to now be more unsafe because there's bombs everywhere there. You start questioning, ultimately, what is this serving in my community, and what has this impact been on their community, and the sort of money and wealth we bring and the violence we can bring. When we say that we're going to sit down and we would like for you to open a school for girls, and we're armed and there's up armored trucks behind me with 50 cal machine guns, of course they're going to be like, sure, we'll start a school. So it's not really it's not a real negotiation. We're very kindly telling them exactly what they're going to do in their own community. And as much as, I'm a fan of education for everyone, right? That's not diplomacy. It shouldn't be at the end of a rifle, right? And we just found ourselves doing a whole bunch of missions that ultimately I don't see that helping Central Jersey, where I'm from.
Yeah.
So
do you think now, with foreign policy being more front and center finally in the course of this election cycle, that has made your pitch for progressive issues easier or more difficult, or has it changed anything at all?
Easier. And I am very glad that it has, because, one thing I've been saying for a while now in this organizing space is that the reason why, like you mentioned, that we can't afford some of these things, or we're told we can't afford these things, is because we're putting all our money into bombs, bullets, and Band-Aids and stuff going overseas, rather than us investing in our education here, rather than us investing in housing and healthcare here. So it's a shame. We have communities in the United States that are slowly deteriorating as we destroy communities on the other side of the world. No one is benefiting. Yeah. The only people who benefit, unfortunately, are the people who make money off this, the corporations that sell the weapons. Yeah. I remember I was with a couple of my Marine buddies a while back, and we saw a video of a U.S.-made tow missile being launched at a U.S.-made up-armored Humvee in Syria. And we joked, but we were very frustrated because we're like, I wonder if there's a defense contractor popping a bottle right now because they've managed to arm both sides of a conflict. That's how much our influence and our weaponry is impacting the world. And that tow missile costs a couple $100,000, right? What could that do to a classroom?
Yeah. So how can people, if they want to know more about Common Defense or the Black Veterans Organization, how can they get in touch with you and participate if they'd like?
So Common Defense, best way to get involved is you can stop by our website, commondefense.us. If you are a veteran yourself and you're interested in getting involved, just text veteran to 52886 and we'll have an organizer get in contact with you. Awesome. If you're interested in the Black Veterans Project, you can just stop by our website, blackveteransproject.org, and you could sign up for our email list.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you so much for joining me. This has been really great.
Thank you.
But I believe from the bottom of my heart, Madam President, that if we go to war, if we spend trillions of dollars on that war, that when our men and women come home from war, some wounded in body, some wounded in spirit, I don't want to hear people telling me it's too expensive to take care of those wounded veterans. I don't accept that. If you think it's too expensive to take care of veterans, don't send them to war.
I'm so glad to be joined today by Hector Barajas for this episode that we've been wanting to do for a really long time about veterans. And your story, Hector, is really fascinating and one that I don't think many people are aware of in terms of what you've gone through. So, Hector, you are a person who has served in our armed forces, but who was also deported. Can you walk me through your journey?
Basically, I served in the armed forces at one point for almost 6 years. Unfortunately, while I was in the military, I didn't process my citizenship for various reasons, failure on my part, but also I believe failure on my command. And it's changed over the years because some people say, well, I got it during basic training, but it's changed over the years. Right now, it's actually even harder to do it through this administration. But I served in the U.S. military with a green card. I was a legal resident, came to the United States at the age of 7 years old, grew up in Compton, California. Grew up like any other American kid. I believe, we did, back then we did the Pledge of Allegiance, we saluted the flag, watched the G.I. Joes and, listen to music that, pretty much I think we all have a connection with. And even though we grew up in different communities, like, I grew up in Compton, was predominantly African-American, Hispanic, there's still certain things that we can all kind of relate to, like, I don't know, like Christmas watching Frosty the Snowman or stuff like that. For sure all the kids watched. So there's a lot of things that I grew up as an American, and that was part of the reason why I joined the military. Yeah. Unfortunately, when I got out of the military, I ended up getting in trouble. I went to prison. I was involved in somebody fired a weapon, discharged a firearm, and I'm not very proud of talking about that. But it's something that happened, and it's unfortunate. Nobody was hurt, but I ended up going to prison. I ended up eventually getting deported, and I snuck back into the country a couple years later. No, actually, like 6 months later, I snuck back in, and then I got caught again, and I finally was deported in 2010. And I had started a family already, so I didn't want to have the risk of just getting pulled over again. And every time I got pulled over, they would impound my car and take it away. That would be like $1,000, and that probably happened like 6 or 7 times. And I just didn't want to go through the whole deportation thing and prison and jail. And I'm like, you know what, I'm going to try to do it the right way. So I decided to stay in Mexico. And previous to me being deported, I actually worked with other veterans that were also facing deportation. But when I got deported, I finally decided to basically tell my story through social media. And that opened up the doors to connecting with other people, organizations. I turned my apartment into a home for veterans, and then over the years it became a resource center where we help the guys out legally. We connect with them with attorneys from the ACLU, public counsel. We help them with pardons. We help them with their VA benefits. We connect them with with resources. We do toy drives. We just did our toy drive a couple days ago. We helped them with sometimes with psychological help through volunteers, and not just, most people think that veterans are, or rather that people that get deported are just Hispanics, but no, we have people deported to all different parts of the world. I recently went to Costa Rica, Haiti, Dominican Republic, but yeah, veterans are deported to 50-something countries. I have a database of about 500 men and women, but I really think it's thousands. And you don't get deported for just committing a crime. It could be overstaying your work permit. It could be not renewing your green card. I have a Vietnam vet that's 78 years old right now that was deported because he didn't renew his green card and never committed a crime. He just never renewed his green card when it came time to, and he's in the process of citizenship at the moment. So just, that's kind of like, but that's just a small snippet of my life. It's been it's been hell and back, to be honest with you.
So let's get into some of that. I mean, one of the things I was reading was that for a lot of veterans, there's an assumption or a belief that serving in and of itself confers citizenship status on you, and it's that the process itself is kind of confusing because the citizenship oath and the oath you take before you serve are actually kind of similar. Was that the case for you?
That was part of it, but I was told by my recruiter. My mom remembers it clearly. I don't, because I suffered a jump injury where I can't remember a lot of things. But my mom remembers. She remembers clearly that the recruiter said you're going to be a citizen automatically, and I believe that part. But then when I started, I was in for almost 6 years. So when I started doing a little, through conversations and stuff, and I eventually realized, wait a minute, I'm not a citizen, and I started the process, but I didn't follow through on it. So there's a lack of education. Yes, there's a process, but if you have, let's say, during any given time, you could have 30,000, 60,000, whatever. During World War II, we had over 200,000 immigrants that served during World War II. So it could be, all these active duty people are not being followed by one particular program or system that tells them at some point, hey, this is the form, this is what you need to do, this is the process. So you could have an assumption, you could have maybe a recruiter that'll lie to you, or you could have a chain of command that really doesn't tell you, hey, you need to do this. And sometimes there are good chain of commands, because I've heard people tell me, my first sergeant, and I've heard people say during basic training, but that was back in 2009. So there have been different things in place throughout the military's history, but there's never been an actual program that followed every single person. And that's what we want to change, so that every person at some point knows, is sat down, whether it's be 2 hours a day. It's either that, that you're educated. When I was in the 82nd, if we were on that within 18 hours, you're going to be deployed anywhere around the world. We made sure that your immunizations were up to date, that your power of attorney, that your will was in place. Why not make sure that before these guys go off into a war, that they're made citizens? Because what happens sometimes is, if they die in combat, they're given posthumous citizenship. So why give it to me when I'm dead?
That's interesting.
There's no relevancy. It can't help me out.
Yeah, it's interesting that
My
you point out
spouse may still be deported.
Yeah, the contrast between the amount of structure and how much clarity there is in the military with respect to other kinds of things as compared to the path to your immigration status is kind of glaring. And I was surprised to read about how you have, as a veteran, a right to VA care, but until your advocacy, hadn't been a lot of real accommodation for people who had been deported, who, despite being deported, still have the right to access medical care. Can you tell me a little bit about what that work has been like?
Sure. So basically what happens is, because we're veterans, and if you have honorable discharge, you technically are supposed to have, that doesn't get taken away from you. So we've been able to figure out ways of getting them their check, their disability rating, get them to get that initial exam. But once they're deported, they don't have the complete access to all the VA benefits. And then also, for the ones that don't get a rating or don't get a disability, I'm at 40% right now. Besides my check, these other guys that don't have a disability rating, hundreds, not thousands, they don't have direct access to what they should have. It's because there's no law saying you don't get it taken away from you. You just don't have access to it. So, these are hundreds, if not thousands, of people that are all over the world that don't have access to that basic healthcare. And depending on what country you're living in, it can be very difficult for basic healthcare. Like in Mexico, it's it takes months sometimes to get seen for certain things, and it's very bureaucratic.
Yeah.
There are things that we just had a guy that passed away because he didn't have a life-saving heart surgery, which it was available in Mexico, but you had to pay for it because the regular, hospitals don't offer to you. So he ended up passing away because he didn't have access to that surgery. And when he was brought back to the United States, when they're taken back to the United States, they're given a burial, a military funeral, and their family's there. And if there's a mother, they're given an American flag, and they say, "Thank you for your service." I'm like, wait a minute, you're thanking them for the service, but yet you deport them, and it just doesn't make doesn't make sense. It is the law, if you break the law, but I think it's wrong. In the United States, we've had many things that, African Americans couldn't vote at one point. Women couldn't vote. We've had slavery. There's been a lot of things in this country that have been done wrong, but we've changed them, and there's still things we need to change, and this is one of them.
Yeah, what seems particularly craven is this idea that, you've put your literal life on the line, and that the U.S. government has relied on immigrants to fight in wars for a very long time. Historically, I was reading that in the 1840s, half of our military was comprised of immigrants, and that through today, significant portions of it are comprised of people from particularly Jamaica and Mexico and the Philippines. And knowing that's the case, and knowing that you're able to rely on people who, many of whom are hoping through the process to become citizens, to kind of knowingly create a system that makes that process opaque or difficult to navigate, and then sets them up to be in these situations where they're not able to get some of the other benefits of being a veteran. It just seems really, really dark.
Yeah, it's really it's kind of vague, and like I said, if you don't have a good I wouldn't even say good. It's just educated people that are educated, that know that this is the process, because sometimes we're ignorant as of what the process is, and same thing with our chain of command. But yeah, we're hoping to change that, and we've been successful in getting some people back, but we really need to change this. Actually, most people don't know this, but by law, every immigrant undocumented that lives in the United States, by law, they have to sign up for selective service, and I'm sure that not everybody does that, but that's the law. That's a requirement, and most people don't know this. That if they live in this country, and if there's a war, there's a draft, they're going to be taken. I've had many Vietnam vets that are deported. They didn't even know English, and they still were sent off to Vietnam. So, if we were to go to war with Russia tomorrow or Iran, all these undocumented people that are males that are of fighting age, they're going to be taken and sent to a war that they probably have no business doing over, or they don't even they hold no allegiance to this country. But oddly enough, I found out that many of them will still go and fight for this country. And we've seen it.
Yeah, I didn't realize that, actually. I mean, it really begs the question, given, of course, what's going on right now with Iran, and and also with the 2020 race, with different candidates being looked at really closely right now to see how their approach in the course of this crisis perhaps is an indication of how they would fare as president of the United States. I'm curious how you perceive Bernie in this context, and what made you want to support him.
Sure. What happened back in 2016 elections, right? That was 2016.
Yeah.
2016.
It was a million years ago, but yes.
One of the things that I ended up connecting with different people, and Cesar Vargas was working with Bernie Sanders at that time, and he told me that Bernie Sanders was going to be at the in Nogales border, and I actually literally jumped on the bus and to drive a couple hundred miles without knowing that I was going to meet him or not, and I didn't get to meet him. I saw him from far away, but eventually Christian Ramirez connected me with him and Cesar as well over here in Friendship Park, and he didn't know I was going to be there, but they told me he's going to be at Friendship Park, and we're waiting on the fence, and we ended up meeting him. But prior to that, we had communicated, and he actually introduced his immigration platform, and part of his immigration platform was to bring home deported veterans and also to work better with our immigrant community. So that it's a very important thing in my life, and something I strongly believe in. And there are a couple of Democrats talking about it, but I don't know if they put it in their immigration platform. but I really that's what really drove me to supporting Bernie Sanders, and I'm barely learning how politics works and learning because I'm barely going to vote for the first time in 2020. So I'm learning how this all works, voting, and to start learning what the candidates are about. So I'm barely in the process, but that's what gets me, and that's what's important for me right now at the moment, for me and the people that I work with. So that's why I'm supportive of it. If there was something I didn't like, well, I would, like I said, I don't even care if it's a Democrat or Republican. Really, to be honest with you, I just want to make sure that the candidate is right for me, right? And that's what I see in Bernie Sanders, and it's important for me, and that's why I'm going to vote for him in 2020 and I'm excited. This is there are people that don't have this opportunity that would like to, and there are people in this country that have this opportunity and they don't go out and vote. So it's very important for us to vote because we complain about our communities and what's going on in the government, but we don't go out and vote. And we need to exercise that power, And but that's what drove me to him. And then one of the things that really struck with me is when I met Bernie, he didn't ask me, because politicians, they're the first thing they're going to ask is, well, what did you do? And I've had that happen especially when I'm Skyping or whatever. So he didn't ask me, like, what did you do to get here? Obviously there was a reason, right? And he didn't ask me. He just said, thank you for your service, and we would like you on this side of the border. So I'm like, wow, that's amazing. Obviously, you do want to know why, what happened, but that was pretty cool, and I'm excited, and we'll see what happens.
So what is your immigration status right now? You're Skyping from Tijuana?
Yes, I'm actually in Tijuana right now, and I continue to do my work. It's been almost 2 years, and I had committed for a year to continue this work, but I want to make sure that I have a good platform, that I leave everything in place so that if I'm here or not, that this work continues, and because it's important for me. It's I could be working right now, making some decent money and going to school, but I wanted to make sure that I make sure that my men and women are taken care of, because it's very important. It really is. It's
Take your time. Hector, it's deeply meaningful. It's deeply meaningful. Please take your time.
It's very important for me, the work that I do, and there's been times when, if it wasn't for the support of my parents and people, I wouldn't be here.
Yeah.
And I have people that have lost their lives or that depend on that we change these laws. And it's literally a matter of life or death for some people, that they have the support system, that whether it's veteran, like I said, even our veterans, that, the ones that are on the streets, the VA system, we've heard many times where people taking their lives in the parking lots, and people that are homeless, struggling, so it's not just about me, but there's a lot of things that need to change in this country, and it's a matter of life and death situation for some people,
Yeah, I think there are a lot of pundits who kind of treat politics like a game, and people like you, and we don't end up on TV so often, and the issues that are truly life and death are kind of dismissed as though the differences between the candidates don't matter. A candidate who doesn't have a policy to return deported veterans and a candidate who does, it's not just a bullet point on a chart to someone like you. And for all of these policies across the board, sometimes people get mad at us for saying it's life and death. Sometimes people get mad at this campaign for talking about how extraordinary the stakes are with respect to veterans, with respect to the environment, with respect to the homelessness crisis, right? But the reality is they are life and death, and I don't think that we should back away from talking about how serious these issues are. And I really want to thank you for taking the time to come and share your story with us so that more people can realize how much this election matters and commit to vote as you've said. So thank you, Hector.
Yeah. Thank you. So it's important for me, and we actually had we had a recent sit down with Bernie Sanders where he met some of the wives, some of the mothers of the veterans that were facing deportation, and also some people that are familiar with policy, and that was very important for us. That was the first time we've sat with any presidential candidate as well, and to actually listen to us about what needs to happen, what needs to change. So I'm hoping that it becomes a talking point in the elections that are coming up, and I'm sure this will come up at some point. But yeah, it's a matter of life and death for certain people. Like I said, especially with veterans, that we have the right to health care, that we have the right support system. It's a matter of life and death for some of my guys and their families, and hopefully we can work to make this country a better country. Like I've seen it over in history. I've seen it where, like I said, we've come away and we fix things, and it's never going to be perfect. Candidates are not perfect. We're human beings. This country is made up of human beings and people that make decisions, but we need to try to have the best person possible with their as we can elect, and that makes it a better place, for everyone,
Thank you for helping make this country a better place, and thank you for your service. Is there
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Can you tell anybody where to find you, where to find your organization?
Sure, they can go to deportedveteransupporthouse.net and then just Google Deported Veterans Support House. There's actually, it's odd enough that we've done so many things on media and documentaries and different things, but still most people don't know this is happening. I guarantee you not even 10% of the population knows that this is happening. But we need to educate people on citizenship, that it's not automatic. You need to start the process, especially for all these veterans that are out of the military. We need to educate people that there's a lot of immigrants that don't do that think a permanent resident is permanent. It's not. You can get deported if you break the law. And also, if you want to change this country, then go out and get your citizenship. And if you want to change this country, go out and vote. It's important.
Thank you, Hector.
Thank you.
That's it for this week. Once again, here's a quick reminder to check your local primary rules, which may require you to register or re-register before a certain deadline in order to participate in the upcoming election. Some states, like New York and Pennsylvania, hold closed primaries, which means you must register as a Democrat in order to vote in the Democratic primary. So, check your local rules and make sure your voice is heard. Take a look at the many ways you can volunteer with the campaign at berniesanders.com/volunteer, including making calls or texting from the comfort of home. Hear the Bern is produced by me, Briahna Joy Gray, Ben Dalton, and Christopher Moore. Let us know what you think at hearthebern@berniesanders.com, or else take to Twitter with the hashtag HearTheBern. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Bernie's YouTube channel for more episodes and other great Bernie content. Till next week,